Okay, we better get started. A few things today. Just a note about some calendar things. Don't forget the Christmas party is a week from Thursday. I have been looking for some scone recipes and I have some ideas. Like I said, if you want to help me bake them, I'm going to bake them in the afternoon in the kitchen. And there will be plenty of room. Scones, they don't look to be as tough as I thought they were, so it's going to be a little bit of a guess. I think I'm going to try making some before the weekend and see how it goes. The second thing, December 24th and 31st, we are not having Bible study. Or at least Father Keller isn't going to be here. The day before Christmas and the week between Christmas and New Year's, we won't be meeting. Or at least, like I said, I won't be here. So I think it's this week and next week. Let's see, so the 3rd, the 10th, and the 17th. And then we'll be finished for December. Some people have asked a little bit, so the chapters, like I said, like when it says chapter 3 and then chapter 7, it doesn't mean everything between them necessarily, but it doesn't hurt you to just continue reading along and chugging along, because very often you do have to read things more than once and look at them and then read it again and let it sink in. I do the same thing. So there are those. And the article on martyrs, this is another one of those Catholic Encyclopedia ones. That's all free online. New Advent hosts the whole thing. It's out of copyright. And, you know, in print, it was, I don't know, it's almost a shelf full on a bookshelf. And the volumes are about that big a piece, and they each had more than 1,000 pages. So there's a lot of good stuff. I mean, you can read until your heart's content on some of those things. So as we look at our timeline, or as you think about it on a timeline, Ignatius of Antioch dies in 107. He was one that we covered last time, and we talked about St. Clement of Rome. I don't remember his dates exactly, but I think he was in the 80s or 90s AD. You'd have to look at that a little bit more. But as we move toward the 2nd century, one of the things that is striking to me is how connected the Christian community is. They are writing letters to each other basically all the time. And most of those letters are lost. They just talk about them in the few documents that we do have. And they weren't included in the New Testament. One of the beautiful things about this time that you have to keep in the back of your mind is that writing is a costly enterprise. Not so much costly in the sense of the things to do it, like paper or some kind of writing medium. They used vellum a lot, which is stretched calfskin or lambskin. They would use, in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, they used a lot of papyrus that was made in Egypt. They don't seem to have been real interested in inventing new forms of paper to write on. Lots of the other ones, I think, don't come about until the later Middle Ages, when they start working on parchment and some of those other things. And then eventually cotton paper, and then wood pulp and the things that we have today. But they do start writing to each other. And so there's this process of collecting and process of sorting out the junk that we don't have today. So if you look at the number of books that are published in the modern world, are they all as worthwhile as Augustine's Confessions? No. Not even close. And this is one of the challenges that we live in the world today, is that writing isn't hard and it's cheap, so anyone can do it. But it also means that instead of having people that are sorting through the junk and choosing the gems, you just have lots of junk. and a few gems, but you have to look for them and you have to know what you're looking for. That's a different process than is at this early time period. And the New Testament per se isn't exactly in existence yet. The Gospels are earlier than the time of Ignatius, but because it takes time to write them and copy them and send them around to different churches, the process of creating a scriptural canon doesn't happen right away. Again, sometimes Protestants will sort of critique this like a list of the Bible books came down from heaven, and that's the opposite of true. Different communities at this time had different collections of books that they noted as scripture. The Old Testament that the Christians used was the Septuagint, by and large. That's this Greek translation from Alexandria. But there were various writings that were considered canonical or read as part of the scriptures in various communities. And there's not a real standardization process until that starts to become problematic. It's a little bit like the old phrase that every rule has a name on it. And in a lot of cases, you don't make the rule until you realize that something went wrong. You know, as parents, sometimes you get ahead of this, but usually you realize it too late. Like, oh, we're not going to do that again. Like, nope, this is now a rule. And you didn't think of it before that. And it's not that it never happened before that. It might not have been an issue, but it's just, that's the way that rule making tends to work. And the same thing happened in Christianity. They didn't write down a lot of questions and answers to them until much later, because people weren't asking those kinds of questions. Jesus doesn't give us systematic theology like St. Thomas Aquinas does. He just didn't. You might want him to. You might think that it would have been easier, but part of me is like, well, he's God and I'm not, so we'll let Jesus do Jesus and we'll try and figure out the rest. But there's this process of organization that's happening in the community. So these letters from different people, especially the letters of Paul, because Paul is an apostle, start to be collected. When he writes his letter to the Corinthians, for instance, it didn't just stay in Corinth. The Corinthians started sharing it with other communities around them, and they started exchanging letters and creating a set of documents that they would use in the liturgy. And about this time, we can note the development of a greater consciousness of being part of something. And this is a little bit weird in the ancient world, because people didn't travel so far from where they grew up, usually, although in a lot of cases, people traveled further than we give them credit for. You know, even in the Middle Ages, this idea that, well, they only traveled within like 10 miles from where they were born is a little bit, I think, idealistic or a little bit naive. They didn't always travel far, that's true, because travel was difficult, but many of them traveled a bit further than our modern mind likes to think that they did. There's a little bit of minimization in there. But they didn't travel like we do now, at least by and large, although some of them traveled as far as any modern person does. I mean, St. Paul, you know, if you looked at the number of miles that he clocked in his journeys around the world, there's probably quite a few. But the Christians start to be conscious of something, that they are part of something that transcends national boundaries. If you remember, the Greeks were very big on that idea that to be Greek was like to be part of civilization and everyone else was barbarians. Christianity picks up on this a little bit, that there's a connection between people of faith that is across national boundaries. That being a Christian means that you're in communion, that you share a spiritual reality with the people that are in Rome and the people that are in Cyrene, which is modern-day Libya, and the people that are in Carthage and the people that are in Greece. There's a greater body that they're a part of. And that idea is very unique. That idea is very much something that wasn't found in history before that in quite the same way. because the Greeks and the Romans and the Spaniards, or the early Spaniards, or whatever you would call them, all of these different groups of people didn't consider themselves to be part of the same thing. At some point, they're kind of begrudging Romans, we could say that, but they don't have the same kind of consciousness of being part of something larger. And by and large, people probably didn't think too much about what we would call the globe, or the people that live on the other side of the world. The other side of the world wasn't very real because no one had been there, at least from the civilizations that were recording things. So they are part of something that transcends these national boundaries, and this community starts to gather around a bishop. They tend to have like a location like Corinth and a bishop. Remember that at this time they don't have a church, at least in any sense that we would recognize today. They might have a house where they meet, but the oldest churches we've ever found in history date from the middle of the 3rd century. So I would put it at like 120 years later than this early time. Now, some of that is because of the story of persecution that we're going to get into, but some of it is they just have a different consciousness and a different sensibility about it. But the bishop becomes sort of the keystone of the local community. The bishop is the successor of the apostles. The bishop is the one who celebrates the liturgy. And this is one of those connections that I tried to highlight in one of those first questions, that it's around the bishop, it's around this community that worships, that we start to have more of that order, more of a discipline, more of an understanding of how this works together. Because the bishop not only celebrated the liturgy, celebrated the Mass, I don't think we have a good idea of how extended it was outside of Mass. It's very, very likely, for instance, that they would celebrate some prayer services as well, but I don't think we have anything from this early time period that describes that in detail that I know of. By the time we get to the middle of the 2nd century, so like 150, and you start to get the writings of people like Irenaeus and St. Justin Martyr, by then we have a better idea of some of the things that they were doing. But at this period of time, writings are still few and far between outside of the New Testament. Did they celebrate a liturgy of psalms? Probably. But which psalms did they use? I don't think we really know. The Egyptian monks, again in the 250s, are going to start claiming that they basically adapted temple services and reorganized a few things and developed what is now called the Liturgy of the Hours that priests and deacons pray. So there's parts of it that are very old, but it's less exacting. Like, we don't have a liturgy book from this time period that says, like, okay, on December 3rd, you'll celebrate St. Francis Xavier. He won't live for 1,300 years or 1,400 years, but that's when you celebrate him. Like, not so much. They also start to develop the sense that being a Christian implies that there are responsibilities. You have a responsibility, like there's a duty. So you have freedom, which is being exercised in communion with God and part of the body of Christ. But freedom implies responsibility. Because you are a child of God, because you are called by grace, because you are redeemed, you have the responsibility to live in a certain way. Those two things go together. So if you think about the liturgy at this time, it seems to have been mixed with a common meal, and you can't tease out exactly what happened. It's like the Christian community would get together and they would eat a meal. And we know that it was a meal because they start making rules about what you can bring to the meal and what you can't bring to the meal and those kinds of things. They start saying, like, this isn't public decorum. You can't have the rich people all on one side of the room and the poor people all on the other side of the room. Like, that's a violation of what we stand for. So they start making rules about a meal, which again, you'd have to argue they're making rules about a meal because those things were already happening. There were these divisions. So they did eat, they often called it an agape meal. So a love meal, a love feast. They take that word directly from Jesus. This is something that is really profound as well, because Christianity, one of the big things about it is that it cut across class boundaries in ancient Roman society, in ancient societies in general. Rich, poor, free, slave, wealthy, all of that, you were part of the same community. You were part of the same communion. You were equally called to holiness and to grace. And Christianity didn't seem to care too much how much money you had. That's very, very alien to this world. That's very, very alien to their experience in society. There were a lot of hard distinctions. If you weren't born in the nobility, the patrician class, there were all kinds of jobs that you could never do. It didn't matter. If you were born as a woman and not a man, there were all kinds of things you couldn't do. Didn't matter. That's just the way that society was. That was accepted by and large. So there was this common meal. They ate together. They had some kind of celebration. And in the midst of that, they start to proclaim, they start to hear the writings that start to form the basis of the scriptures. So they become particularly fond of the writings of the apostles, and this is the foundation of the New Testament. After the readings, the presider, the bishop usually, or the presbyters, these elders that assist the bishop, would give some kind of exhortation, a homily, a sermon, whatever you want to call it, that kind of thing, to try and apply the scriptures to the lives of the hearers. They would then have a time of intercession for the whole Christian community. They would offer their prayers to God. This is probably a lot less organized than it is now, a lot less formal. In some sense, I would say a good sign of a healthy community would be if you didn't have to have as much organization of the prayers of the faithful or the petitions in the liturgy. If people were formed in a way where you knew how to say them well in a way that applied to everyone, there's a beauty to it that people from the community would offer prayers, kind of like we did for Pat this morning. That was a part of their this early liturgy. They would then offer bread and wine. You'll note that there is no way that you could talk about fasting before you receive Holy Communion in the midst of a common meal. That comes later. That's a part of a discipline that develops over time. And also at this time, they did not have nice little stamping machines that made little hosts that don't make a lot of crumbs. They would have had substantial bread. For a large part, it seems like they would have been using basically Jewish matzo. It's just wheat flour and water. So like stuff that irritates the modern conscience, like crumbs, don't seem to have been the biggest concern. And that's not to say that the modern concern is bad or that the ancient one is better. It's just that practice develops over time. It's a reflection on the presence of Christ. They also don't have tabernacles right away. That only develops later in the bringing communion to the sick. That's where tabernacles start. And then Christians kind of decide that they like them, and then tabernacles start spreading to lots of other places. But at this early time, it was kind of the one liturgy and that was it. And probably a liturgy that was celebrated on Sunday at some point, maybe late on Saturday evening. They would mix wine with water. And this is something that the modern world has kind of forgotten. In the ancient world, you should know that water wasn't all that healthy to drink in lots of places. There's all kinds of problems with water because it can get stuff in it. You know, they don't have good ways, like they don't have good filters, for instance, to get the dirt out. They would build wells and they would line them with stones or sometimes with cement to try and keep the dirt out. But, you know, if the leaves fell in the well and you put down your bucket to get some water, you might have some leaves in it. Now, you wouldn't drink them, but the people had this consciousness that water sometimes made them sick. And so it was actually more common to have some kind of fermented beverage like wine or beer, because that would kill some of the bacteria and some of the mold and other things that could be in water that were bad for you. It's also the case that most of this world lives in places that are very, very warm, and liquids evaporate. So when they made wine, they would save it in wine skins, like they would flip an animal's stomach. I forget if they flip it inside out or they keep it, but they would seal it off on one end, sew it together, and then they would fill it and they'd try and seal the top. But even then, those are permeable membranes, and so over time, the liquid evaporates. So wine gets stronger and stronger and stronger as it gets later, which is probably better because it kills more things, you know, the alcohol concentrates and that kind of stuff. But that meant that when you drank it, you almost always mixed it with water. The Romans have a kind of funny thing that it was immoral to drink unadulterated wine. If you had wine that wasn't mixed with water, they thought that was a sign of like, you know, prostitution and things like that. I mean, they had a very low opinion of people who did that. And so that sense gets imported into the liturgy, that the wine that you use at the Mass is mixed with water. Now it's changed in the sense that we usually mix just a little bit of water with a larger volume of wine. They would have to dilute the wine out because it would be much more like brandy or a concentrated spirit in a lot of cases. So that's where that comes from in the liturgy today. Now, it gets spiritualized later, and there's this neat little prayer about like coming to share in the divinity of Christ who humbled himself to share in our humanity. That's the prayer, and that's a beautiful thing. But lots of cases of things that develop in early Christianity were practical. Like they start building tents over altars in the 300s. Why do they build tents over altars? So the birds don't poop on your altar. And eventually it becomes symbolic of the wedding tent, and they have this whole development, and they make them artistic and beautiful. That's true, but they started because they didn't want the birds to poop on the altar. So they built a tent over it. Bishops' hats, the little zucchettos that they wear, happened because the monks would shave their heads and their heads would get cold in churches, so they would wear hats. And eventually that gets adopted by bishops. Like there's all kinds of stuff like that that started out as practical and ended up as being something kind of spiritual or having a different meaning. The heart of the liturgy was the prayer called the priestly prayer, or anaphora, was the high priestly prayer. This included the consecration of bread and wine into the body and blood of Jesus. We have a few, very few, early examples of what this prayer may have looked like. A little bit. But we don't have very much. It certainly wasn't standardized. It's not like the priest had a written book with a prayer. And so sometimes Christians complain that the priest prayed too long. Sometimes the Christians complained that the priest or the bishop prayed too short, or used the wrong words or said the wrong thing. So over time they start to write them down. But at this point, we don't have them written down. But they see this liturgy, this prayer over the bread and wine as connected with the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross and with the Last Supper, just like we do today. With the difference, they're very, very fond of noting that it's an unbloody sacrifice. That's a big deal for these early Christians. Why do you think that would be a big deal? Unbloody sacrifice. Yes, the previous ones involved the killing of animals and their blood. And in paganism all around them, everything is killed. You're always killing something. The Romans, that's one of the other odd things I don't think I mentioned before. They were not very fond of child sacrifice. They accepted a lot of religious traditions, but I think they almost always stopped that one. Didn't mean they didn't kill their children. They would expose them and do other things. But the Romans weren't to that degree for the most part. But their point, the early Christians' emphasis, is that this is an unbloody sacrifice. It's symbolic in that sense. Now, it's a real symbol. It's also sacramental, but it's still symbolic. It's a symbolic gesture of the offering of Christ, of the offering of Jesus himself. And so they're very, very fond of that. And I think part of that is just because of the world that they live in. For us today, it would be very weird to go into a place, for instance, where they're constantly doing things like sacrificing chickens or goats or other animals. Most people, that would kind of give the shivers and you'd walk away from that place. But that was standard society at this time. That was like what was everywhere. Most of the meat that was eaten at all was sacrificed to some idol or another. So the Christians in this liturgy, this was a time of somewhat extended Thanksgiving. Again, how long was their liturgy or their Mass on the clock? I have no idea. I don't think we have a good guess. But several hours, at least, is very likely. It might not also have had a direct consecration of the elements of bread and wine right away. That part we don't know. Some of the oldest Eucharistic prayers that we have that are written down aren't as explicit. Where now in the Mass we have like these ritualized gestures. We take bread, we say, "This is my body, which has been given up for you." Those kind of things. All of that phrases, the earliest Eucharistic prayers that we have aren't quite that explicit. They believe that it happened, but they don't always come out and say it in plain English. They certainly don't say it in plain English, but neither do they say it in plain Greek. But this is kind of the beating heart of Christian life. The community gathered on Sunday or Saturday to celebrate this liturgy, and that was a formal part of what they did. Now, what happened the rest of the week? That's one of the good questions that I was trying to find some more answers to, and as nearly as I could tell, we don't know. We do know that they started some kind of catechesis program for people that wanted to convert. We talked about the discipline of the secret last time. So if you weren't part of the community, there were a lot of events, like if you weren't baptized yet, you probably couldn't participate in this agape meal and the Mass at all. They wouldn't even tell you about it until after you were on this process toward being baptized. They have a discipline around it. And part of it, a huge part of it, is because of this next major topic, which is persecution. And I think our author does us a lot of services here, because we have kind of funny ideas about persecution, or at least I know I did for most of my life. So persecution we usually connect with death penalty and with Christians who were killed for their faith. That happened, but that's usually not the majority of persecution. Think of communism in our own days. The communists actually didn't kill very many Christians for being Christian. They do kill some, but for the most part, persecution was administrative. They don't let you build churches. They try to stop your meetings. They try to stop you from printing scriptures. There's all of these other ways that they sort of weaponize the government against you. The ancient Romans had that as well. Like when we start talking about persecution, yes, people died for their faith, and we're going to talk about that, but that was only part of it. And that was likely a small part of it. Like, we forget all of the administrative, bureaucratic junk that we have in our world today. And the Romans didn't have as much of it, but they certainly had administrative and bureaucratic junk. And you have to remember that the system was much more corrupt. So very, very quickly, an easy way to steal your neighbor's land is to denounce them as a Christian. You have a field, your neighbor is a smarter farmer than you, and his field looks nicer, so what do? You go to the magistrate and you say, that man's a Christian. And you hire a few of your friends to be witnesses to the same thing, and so they throw the Christian in prison, or they issue a legal decree, and they say, okay, you can steal his land. It's yours now. That was part and parcel of this world. The wealthy almost always got their way and almost never got caught. There's no audits. There's no, psycho accreditation people who come through and look through every line of your accounting book to make sure that every dollar that you say you have got in the right place. In some cases, they'd say, oh, there's errors. They just burn the accounting book. They come, we don't have it. What happened? There was a fire. Don't say who started the fire, but you start to see, we had to sort of shift our idea of what persecution is. Because yes, the Christians die, but persecution is much, much larger than that. And it also helps solve part of the problem that we tend to have the impression that the Romans sort of decided they hated Christians and then started killing them everywhere for hundreds of years. And they didn't. That piece of the sort of common narrative of Christianity isn't true. Yes, they do kill Christians, but if you remember how we talked before about the Roman Empire being a lot more hubs and spokes, so the cities were usually where it was most intense, and sometimes you'd have a governor, for instance, who wants to get ahead, and they think that the way to get ahead is to do what Caesar wants, and what Caesar wants was, to persecute the Christians, so they go crazy persecuting Christians, and another governor is like, they're kind of nice people, and the guy that runs my treasury is a Christian, and he's not so bad. So we're just going to sort of, put those in the scrap heap. And if the Romans, if people come from Rome, we'll say it just came a few weeks ago. We're still thinking. You can have widely different experiences on different sides, different provinces. So for instance, the Western Roman Empire, so Italy, France, Spain, the western side never persecuted Christians as heavily as the eastern side did. Greece, Turkey, Israel, those kind of areas. It just wasn't the same kind of thing. Now in pockets, sure, but by and large the Western Roman Empire doesn't have the same kind of challenge with that. It's also important to remember that our battle is not just, this isn't just like people versus other people or us versus them. This is also a spiritual battle. Satan doesn't want the religion to spread. And just like we have modern temptations around all kinds of things, there were ancient temptations around this as well. That Satan is going to do his best to try to stop Christianity from spreading. And the early Christians recognized this. They saw it that not all the Romans were immoral. They pray for the emperor. They pray for the Caesar. They do all these things. Peter talks about paying taxes to Rome, even though by that point, Rome was likely beginning the first persecutions of Christians. And Peter still says, pay your taxes. He says it plainly. It's in the New Testament. Sorry.